All right, welcome back to Sensible 2020. Here's the keynote, fireside chat with Steve Hawkins and Ben Jealous. I mean, come on. Steve, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Very much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.
Great to be here.
All right, so we got to kick it off. Ben, you said that you met Steve when you were 16 years old. Is that right?
Yeah. 16 years old. And we were in Austin, New York. I'd gone to church with a friend. Steve was a young lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and I was paying full attention because that's where I wanted to work. And we reconnected 2 years later. I was a student at Columbia University, and I was working in the mailroom of the LDF, and somebody asked if I knew anybody there, and I said, well, I saw this Steve Hawkins guy once, and we've been friends ever since.
That's amazing. Steve, I'm sure you remember the 16-year-old kid coming up to you at the church, right?
I do. And I remember.
You really do?
I do. And I remember when I was, Ben interned at the Legal Defense Fund one night, literally, Seth, it was probably, 8 o'clock at night. I was working on a case that had to be filed. 3 African-American kids railroaded in Memphis, Tennessee, actually. I have documents that I have to put together. Ben's I look around and there's only one other light on and Ben's there. I say, hey, it's only going to take an hour. You mind helping me with these documents? We probably left there at like 2 o'clock in the morning.
Each of you guys, happy to put in the time. And, we're Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Here's where we are. You both are known for building movements. And so I guess, Ben, when you take, a bunch of steps back and kind of look back at the career, let's go big early here. What are the keys?
You step back for a second. The end of the day, the most important thing is to be effective. And Steve and I really got baptized at the same time. We were working together, the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. And that movement had been stuck for 20 years. And the death penalty in America was abolished in 72, was reestablished in 1976. And that's when NAACP was founded. And Steve and I came on board in 1996. And it was the 20th anniversary of the reinstatement of the death penalty. So for a movement, what it marked is we've been failing for a generation. And the strategy the entire time had been the same as it had been in 1972. We were using the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution to prosecute an equal protection claim, ultimately in the Supreme Court, saying that people were discriminated against based on race, based on class, a whole range of factors, but predominantly race. And we kept losing, and the case law kept getting worse. And the funders decided, little unbeknownst to us, because I had just taken a job with Steve, and he just started a few months before that they were going to pull the plug on all the funding. And we, in that kind of called in a pressure of Steve cutting his salary in half, me cutting in mine, which was already pretty low, but 20% or so, and then us not getting paid for 3 months and having to lay off the rest of the staff. Decided to shift that movement from being based on kind of a single victory in the Supreme Court to building towards the Supreme Court through a series of state legislative victories by using an Eighth Amendment approach. Now, the Eighth Amendment to the US Constitution forbids cruel and unusual punishment. It's based on 1,000 years of British common law that bans cruel or unusual punishment. Get the difference between or and here it has to be both. And so we went about changing the American anti-death penalty movement by shifting it from a movement where people were basically doing public education to support lawyers to being a movement where people were passing state-level bans on a range of different categories of the death penalty, if you will. Passing a ban on juveniles, passing a ban on people with very low IQs, passing a ban on the mentally ill, etc. All getting to a place where once we had a majority of states, then we could go into the Supreme Court and say, it's not just cruel, it's now also unusual as represented by state law and ban it for the country. And in the last 20 years, 23 years, since Steve and I turned around that movement strategy, what we've seen is the death penalty has been abolished for all juveniles. The death penalty has been abolished for all people with very low IQs. And the death penalty has been abolished in its entirety and now approaching 20 states. And which means that we're only a handful of states away from getting to that 26 threshold. And when we get to that 26 threshold, we'll be able to abolish the death penalty in its entirety. What we learned in that is this. One, you've got to have a strategy that you have faith in and that everybody can have faith in. Two, you've really got to lead with, frankly, marketing and communications and engaging the public where they are. And three, you've got to recognize that everybody in the movement is extremely valuable. The person who played the most critical role in abolishing the juvenile death penalty was 16 years old when we started that campaign and under 25 when we finished it. She was the only advocate in 20 states, 10 of which the ABA tried and failed in with the wealthiest law firms in the country, 7 of which Steve and I sent more senior organizers to. And the last 3, we sent a young lady named Joteka Edie to. And she used a playbook that nobody else had that she had developed when she was in high school, which was to build a diverse, both racially and politically diverse coalition against the death penalty. She would get the NAACP chapter or the Amnesty chapter to create common cause with student pro-life groups. And that ended up being the secret sauce. Again, we tried and failed. To get to 26, we needed 3 states. We tried and failed. We targeted 20. We failed in 17. Joteka won all 3 of hers, and they were the hardest states: South Dakota, Wyoming, and New Hampshire, as a young Black woman from South Carolina. And so that's frankly why we do these talks and why we engage young people, is because our own life has taught us it's oftentimes the youngest person in the room who's poised to have the greatest success.
So I want to come back to that. Steve, you and I have talked about intersectionality in the past, and that change in strategy from the 14th Amendment to the 8th Amendment, what it did was it went from being technically correct, because who cares if you're right, to really shifting the mindset and starting a movement. Am I hearing that right, Steve?
That is correct. That's absolutely right. And when I think about where we are in terms of cannabis reform, what does that movement look like, right? And how to make it a broader civil and human rights struggle is precisely, I think, what's needed. We will not win in Congress. And it's the same formula that Ben just described. We have to get to 20 to 25 states before I think we have a tipping point in Congress. We're not going to get there strictly by industry lobbyists. It is going to take a movement that includes labor, right? That includes civil rights, activists, human rights advocates. We have to approach it from all sort of levers to be really effective, I think.
Yeah, and taking cannabis as kind of the leading indicator of drug policy reform, I think that there are other substance groups that are seeing cannabis and saying, we actually can do better than that. What are your thoughts on, hey, listen, we did a great job in Illinois in making sure that law really was the best one out there, but what about not good enough? What are your thoughts?
What we've seen in the midst of this pandemic is cannabis has been deemed essential, but not equal, right? Essential in one state, you can cross the border into the next state and get arrested. So what it tells me is that we still have to continue to build the work in the states, but also hopefully be able to use this moment to as an inflection point, right? That gets the public thinking differently about cannabis use, because it is proving to be popular during this pandemic, and that says something, I think, about where the American public is, right? We know that 67% of the public is with us today, right? So the question really is going to be, how do we get the electeds and political leadership to catch up with really where the public already is?
Yeah, and that's I think when I ran for governor of Maryland last year. It's the or 2018, last cycle. And I was the Democratic nominee. And I started off fourth in the primary, and I was clearly the most pro-cannabis legalization candidate. And it did not keep me from leaping to first in that primary and winning by a wide margin. And what I found in that is, it's true, 67% of people agree with us. It's similar here in our state. However, it's not top of their list. It's not the most important thing to them. And if you want to get them to really focus, you want to get that state senate president to focus, you want to get that voter to focus, you want to get that candidate to have courage, then you've got to connect it to something that they care more about. And what do they care about? They care about health, and in particular, health costs. They care about schools, and in particular, school funding. They care about jobs. And we have something to say, obviously, on all three of those things. But you've got to lead with those things. It can't be like oh, by the way, this is helpful with education, or this is helpful with jobs, or, this is helpful to folks, who are being soaked by the pharmaceutical industry, but could deal with, that ailment in a more natural, healthier, and less expensive way. And that's where I think, frankly, the movement has to do some work. When I was, look, I had the most charming, charismatic person in my life pushing me, with Dave Chappelle, my godbrother, since I was, 20 years old or 18, to support cannabis legalization. And while I was kind of predisposed to it, it just wasn't important to me, but what was important was ending mass incarceration. I wasn't thinking about how many people were being, locked up. And for me, that's the point when I began to focus. And with voters and with legislators, they're probably not going to be focused on de-incarceration. That's Ben Jealous's sort of fixation. With them, it's going to be education, it's going to be healthcare, it's going to be jobs, and we've got to be very sophisticated in how we talk about it.
However, as far as you brought up de-incarceration, and here we are, of the moment, people are really talking about it. My sister wrote an article about how, Governor Cuomo's father, Governor Cuomo, was sued and lost. What about taking, a moment, yes, okay, fine, global pandemic, whatever moment, and really using it for everything that you can?
Just hurry on that. The environment, mass incarceration, this issue, what do they all have in common? Yeah, a lot of people care about them. A lot of people agree with us, and there's no emotional energy for the voter. It does not drive their decision-making on kind of what to do with their day. And so you've got to connect them to an issue where there is real emotional energy and urgency. And the urgency is jobs. The urgency is funding education, and the urgency is affordable health care. And if you can connect it to any one of those in your state, then you got something to work with as far as being the priority. Steve and I have both been part of legislative campaigns where there was broad public agreement, but nobody would prioritize it. So you get priority when you connect it to one of those big three issues.
I think coming out of this crisis that we're all living through, jobs, right? The cannabis industry has hired people who've been let go in the current crisis from their old jobs. And look, the argument going forward will be, if you need something, cannabis can be an economic engine, it can create jobs for the future, it can be part of the recovery. And I think Ben is spot on, and I think that the more we can talk about the opportunity for jobs that will be good paying jobs and readily available, once New York State passes and legalizes cannabis, it's a no-brainer. There's, I guess, 300,000 jobs in the industry now, and it's projected to be 1 million, right? So there's a lot of room for growth.
So that's the industry side of things. Many of the sessions here at Sensible 2020 are dealing with people who use drugs and what we can do for them. So building a healthcare system, for people who use drugs, getting them the protection that they need, getting them the safe, havens that they need. What are your thoughts on that focus of, the end user, so to speak? How do we bridge that gap, and how do we connect those dots for a voter or for a state senator when we're talking about, at the end of the day, people who use drugs?
You've got to see the end user, if you will, of any policy as being the public, at large. If you're, talking about safe places for use, you've got to think about it from the perspective of somebody who simply wants their city to be a safe, humane, but safe place, and talk about it from that perspective. You've got to talk about it as far as, a lot of people who are addicted to, very dangerous substances like heroin, for instance, been a big problem in Baltimore for a long time, are also parents. And you've got to, talk about, sort of the realities of addiction and how you ultimately set them up to, kick what is a very dangerous habit. And so it requires, it's not enough to just assert what's right. You've got to be prepared to make the argument that's going to stick with the person that you're talking to. And that means you have to put yourself in their shoes, because at the end of the day, succeeding in politics is about understanding what the other party's self-interest is and speaking to it.
Is there a difference? I'll ask Steve first, and then Ben, I'd love your thoughts here, on politics and policy. And if there is, does it matter?
I think that there is a difference, right? Because good, effective policy that reasonable people can say, that makes a hell of a lot of sense. It doesn't always latch to the political reality of a moment, right? And it takes and you wait for that opportunity, or you create the opportunity where the two converge. That's my thought. Ben?
The politics shifts, good policy shifts more slowly. In fact, in other words, it's what's right from a policy perspective is often right for a long time, but what's right from a politics perspective is very seasonal. It's very fickle. And my grandmother would always say that 90% of luck is preparation. If you look at second at sort of the other side of the coin, you look at the conservatives who have been pushing very dangerous ideas to our democracy, like voter ID. What's remarkable about them is their persistence, that they pushed and failed for 10 years before they won the first state. And then they won several states very, very quickly. And at the heart of that movement is a real belief in the power of positive thinking, which we, the left, oftentimes ridicule. It's not rational. It's hokum, whatever. You hear a lot of folks kind of put it down. But going back to my grandma, who was a social worker in Baltimore, who set up Child Protective Services in the 50s and led a crusade as a young woman against literally sex clubs that existed for the exploitation of children in Baltimore. Very courageous thing to do. A lot of powerful men were involved in those clubs. She would always say to me, optimists, so the difference between a pessimist and an optimist, she said, pessimists are right more often, but optimists win more often. And at some point you have to decide in politics whether it's more important to you to be right, knowing that you are more likely to lose, or whether you are more interested in winning on that issue. And what does that mean? What she's talking about is this. If you think of politics like boxing, the pessimist steps into the ring and says, you know what, I'm going to get in that ring, I'm going to get knocked down. And you know what? Most of the time they're right. The optimist steps into the ring and says, you know what, this might be the round I don't get knocked down. Well, what happens after 5 rounds? The pessimist throws in the towel, goes home. Like, I know it. Every time I get in the ring, I get knocked down. The optimist hangs out for the 6th round, the 7th round, the 8th round. And you know what? As long as she or he's the only person standing at the end of that round, they win. No matter how many times they were knocked down before, as long as they kept getting back up. It's the optimism that gets you back up. And so while it may not be rational, while it may require faith, my recommendation to every young activist is to keep the faith, to be an optimist, to understand that you will lose many battles before you win, but you will only win a battle if you keep getting back up.
So optimism, resilience. Steve, I'm hearing, these are some of the themes I'm also seeing in each of these sessions here at Sensible 2020. There are tremendous young leaders here in this organization. So we do all have to remember, me included, it doesn't matter if you're right. What else is on this list of things that are musts in moving that ball forward? It doesn't matter how long it takes, just as long as if we get hit in the face, get up, dust yourself off, keep going.
I always say that you have to be ready for opportunity, and the thing about opportunity is it's never opportune, right? It never comes when at your convenience. And sometimes you have to be able to move on a dime, switch tactics, whatever. But seizing opportunity is part of, I think, success in any movement.
No, that's right. And, I grew up surfing in Northern California in the school years and, running the streets of West Baltimore in the summer. And what I learned surfing is that it's all about timing. And as an organizer who may be working on a range of issues, right? You may have 4 or 5, 6 issues on the SDP agenda that's important to you. You've got to develop a sense in your gut about what can move when and which one you really emphasize. We in the anti-death penalty movement have had to be very opportunistic and very sensitive to changes suddenly in public opinion because there's a high-profile murder case, for instance. Every time that we've won, it was because somebody stood up and said, "This is the time, let's go." And so, learning how to kind of surf, if you will, in politics is very important. Having a real sense of timing. This is the time. In surfing, if you stand up a little bit too late, it's a disaster. If you stand up a little bit too early, it's a disaster. It's the same thing in politics. You got to hit your moment at the right moment. And for that, you really got to kind of cultivate that intuition. And you do that, of course, it's the same way that you learn to surf, but just trying and failing a lot. But you got to embrace each failure as an opportunity to learn and understand that even as you may keep failing, you're getting smarter and smarter, and it's all setting you up to win and to ride that big wave.
Steve, Ben's talking about surfing. I don't know if you want to continue that analogy, but what
Steve's
he mentioned,
a long-distance runner. Steve once, so when Steve and I worked together the first time around, or the second time around, we've worked with him many times in our career. He would always be there like at 7 a.m. He was that boss who just kind of annoyed you because he knew if you were late, right? And I would just kind of embrace that by always being late. I show up at 10. So this one day, Steve's walking in behind me at 10:02. And I'm like, what the hell happened? He's like, "Oh, I got lost this morning. I set out to run 6 miles. I ended up running 28. I was just like, really, man? Like you couldn't even just give me one day where you slept in. You had to be running 28 miles. But
he had to be running a marathon by mistake.
More than a marathon by himself on a whim simply because he got lost. Other people would have hailed a cab. Back then we didn't have Uber, but you could have found a payphone. Steve just kept running until he found his way home, and it happened to be 28 miles.
I don't mean to, it's going to sound kind of, a little heavy-handed, but isn't that the whole lesson, Steve? Sure, yeah, you're out there on your feet, you're running, you just keep running, you run more than a marathon. Isn't that what we're talking about, that resilience piece, mind, body, soul, and also drug policy?
Well, yeah, you have to have resilience, absolutely. That's also part of the special sauce, and it goes to, it's the same as Ben's description of optimism, right? You have to be able to get back up, or to continue the race,
or to know when to get a hip replacement.
Yeah, now I do about 6 miles, and every one of them hurts like hell.
I will say this, what we've found here is the most embarrassing thing about Steve Hawkins is that he can get lost. And if he gets lost, he runs too much. Like, that's the worst thing you can say about Steve.
Now I'll call it Uber.
That's right. And he always finds his way back home.
There we go. Well, if you always find your way back home, I wonder if maybe this is a good time. A key failure, and you know, Ben, you mentioned kind of a change in strategy earlier. I don't know if you would count that as a failure. That each of you can bring up for you know, for the audience here, where you know, because you learn from the failures the most. So maybe not the biggest failure, but at least a key failure along the way. Either one of you, but because I'd love one from both of you, if you don't mind.
You know, I'll jump first. You know, I ran for office for 2 years, right? Wrapped that up at the end of 2018. And somewhere I kind of lost sight of the historic nature of what we were trying to accomplish. Maryland's never had a black governor. And therefore, the sort of special kind of slings and arrows that we were likely to be subjected to, and there were a lot. But because I lost perspective, because I was just frankly focused on running a race as a candidate, winning a race as a candidate, you know, running as an outsider for governor should be enough. You shouldn't have to be like first, especially when your people have been at least 30% of the population forever. But setting that aside, my failure was that I lost perspective. And so there was a moment when I won the Democratic nomination and they released just millions of dollars of advertising from the Republican Party seeking to define me because they knew I burned up all of my cash going to the primary. Meanwhile, the incumbent Republican had no primary, so he'd stacked up cash. And they sought to define me as a socialist. And it was problematic for me on a bunch of levels, including the fact that I'm a venture capitalist. I invest in social impact businesses. Accusing me of being a socialist is like accusing the guy who owns the steak shop of being a vegan. Like, yeah, it's technically possible, but it's probably not the case. And so reporter asked me at a press conference if I was a socialist. I gave a 2-minute professorial answer, like I've done many times here tonight. And then she asked me again, yeah, but are you a socialist? And I just said, are you fucking kidding me? And of course, that became the entire story. You know, it won me votes in the inner city. It lost me votes in the suburbs. But the reality is that when you're taking on something really big in history making, when you're taking on something really big in history making and path breaking, you got to understand that there's going to be times when it just chafes, when it hurts in ways that you did not expect. And you got to take a step back, you know, get up on the balcony of history, understand that whatever you're going through is exactly what you would expect to be going through when you've got a real chance to transform the status quo. And so, you know, my advice to folks is, you know, really, again, it goes back to resilience, it goes back to optimism, but it also goes back to, frankly, maintaining the humility, the bold humility of somebody who signed up to change history.
So that's gathering myself because that's you know, quite an impactful anecdote, Ben. But your point there is you lost yourself. Steve, you know, what would be one for you? Because, you know, Ben's saying if you're going to show up, show up. You know, if you are changing history, realize you're changing history. Don't lose perspective of that. So when they try to get under your skin with the little stuff, don't let them do that, even though it's easy and you've been trying real hard and all of that. But what would you add as far as maybe a key lesson along the way?
Yeah, sometimes you know that you will lose, but you win at the same time. I remember being a young attorney, maybe probably about 30 years old. I represented a Black man on death row in Utah named Bill Andrews. And I came into his case late, you know, brought in to sort of try to help, you know, he was close to execution. And in the midst of his jury deliberation, Seth, when the jury had finished in the lunchroom, a game they had played they had taken a napkin and they had drawn a hangman, and then they had written the word Nigger, right? Finished their hangman. So the judge no system in Utah, no judicial system had ever given that any real analysis, right? They put the bailiff on the stand. He didn't see anything. It was just a complete whitewash. So I came in and organized the Black clergy in Salt Lake City and others. And the one hearing that we had, I came in with a huge sign, depicting what had happened, and the place just erupted. There was supposed to be a day where they were going to set the execution date. The judge, his wrist was shaking. He had never had so many Black people in his courtroom, and he just dismissed it. Of course, when we came back 2 weeks later, there was a phalanx of state troopers around the entire, courtroom outside, and they set an execution date. But as I said with Bill Andrews the night of his execution, he said that that moment was the only time he felt like a man and was proud, and felt that people had cared about him. And I knew we were going to lose, but I wasn't going to take it lightly, and I was going to make a point. And sometimes that's all you can do.
It's kind of going on that riff for a second. It reminds me of the Troy Davis case that Steve and I were involved in off and on for a decade and a half. And, I was on death row with Troy, and we were talking about our hope that the Board of Pardons and Paroles would spare his life, because one of the white members had switched their vote. It was split racially 3-2. We had both Black members. You get one white member, you win. And the last vote had been 3-2 against Troy on racial lines. And ultimately, Troy understood the situation better than any of us. He said, Ben, he said, that's great. He said, we'll see what happens. He said, but this is Georgia. If they want to kill me, they will. Sure enough, the Black chairman would switch his vote. So we'd end up with one Black member, one white member opposed, and two white members and one Black member supporting the execution. So the Black chairman was content to vote against it as long as he would know he would be outvoted. But when it was clear he was going to, be part of the coalition that would stop the execution, then he folded. Troy, in the midst of that, said, but no matter what you do, make sure that they remember my name. And because he pushed so hard, he said, we have to stop the machinery of death in this country. And the public has to know what's happening here, that they're going to execute an innocent man in Georgia. And so we built a social media campaign. We couldn't get 60 Minutes in. The warden wouldn't let it, even though they wanted to come. And we made the hashtag Too Much Doubt the number one hashtag tweeted after Beyonce is pregnant. So number 2 that year, 2011. And after Troy was executed, public opinion, public support for the death penalty fallen to its lowest level since 1972. And we would go on to abolish it in the next 12 months in Connecticut, despite the fact that there was a high-profile murder case that normally would keep us from making progress in a year like that. And to abolish it in Maryland, the first state south of the Mason-Dixon to ever abolish the death penalty. And it was 100% because people remembered Troy's name and what happened. That's what switched public opinion, in our favor. And it was the wisdom of a death row inmate who was about to lose his life. You can't lose any bigger than that. But who also understood, going back to my point earlier, his historic importance, understood that because he was an innocent man, he had special power. The movement had special power to shift public opinion if we would not simply focus on saving him, but also focus on making sure that everybody understood what was about to happen.
It's both of you are mentioning ultimate losses when, so if we can pull wins out of truly ultimate losses, then wins can truly be around any corner.
Exactly right. Look, this movement should be very, very bullish. Things have come a long way in the last 25 years. Cannabis legalization is just a matter of time. I was a manager of the first federal harm reduction housing program in the country, and we were providing safe places for people, who were addicts and had HIV to use, so they weren't spreading HIV, by using in ways that were unsafe. And it was very controversial to do that back in the 1990s. But these ideas have really become much more mainstream. And I'd say cannabis legalization is mainstream, and a lot of other ideas are very close. And so to this young generation, I would say lean in, be optimistic. Yes, be resilient, be dogged, understand, that you will probably have children and send them to college in the time that it takes, to win everything that you're hoping to win. But you will be the generation that sees this change in their lifetime. And that's exciting. That's exciting.
Ben Jealous, Steve Hawkins, we can't end it any better than that. Let's see what the community is saying. Very much appreciate your time.
Thank you.